At Texans Care for Children, we work to improve outcomes for Texas kids by looking at the whole child. And so today you will see, as we talk about each of our different areas of focus, that we will, the lens that we take to that is making sure that in each of our areas we are still promoting good outcomes for kids in all the realms and all the aspects that children live and play in. We will be focusing just on major pieces of legislation. As an organization, we track hundreds of bills and of the thousands that our legislature is currently covering. So we will only hit the highlights, and not all of them that you'll see on our slides we'll be speaking about today. But certainly if you have any questions on any of them, please do feel free to contact our policy staff. Also, please note that inclusion in the webinar does not indicate that we support or oppose any of these bills, but rather that these are the major pieces on the landscape. So getting first to public investments, which is a background piece that really impacts all areas of child well-being and all areas of well-being for our communities and families. We will be speaking within each of our policy areas on specific points of HB1, SB1, our budget, how particular issue areas are impacted and addressed in the budget. But as a broader piece, when we look at some proposals that are being considered, there are some that increase our ability to see what's happening with our budget and increase the ability of our budget to be responsive to the needs of our communities. And there's a slew of bills specifically that look at an annual budgeting process. Most of you on the call who are involved in advocacy are probably aware that our legislature meets every 2 years, and so therefore our budget is based on a lot of estimations. But by going to an annual budgeting process, there's opportunity for responsiveness on a shorter time period. HJR 41. Moving on to the next set of bills in terms of tax exemptions, there's a bunch of bills, very exciting, different than in the previous session. There's been a lot of focus to the idea of reviewing tax exemptions. And when you look at the tax exemptions that exist, they're a huge component in terms of what resources we have available as a state to address the needs of our communities. And so in particular, HB 536 actually would allow for a revision of, for a review of tax exemptions specific to individual companies and what benefits they have. Similarly, SB 156 really has an interesting component in that it benchmarks our tax exemptions to ensure that to the extent that tax preferences are given to companies or to individuals, that the needs that they are set to address are actually being addressed, so that as we leave that money on the table, we make sure it has an express purpose. More to the issue of transparency and responsiveness, including the Economic Stabilization Fund and the available revenue, these couple of bills acknowledge the fact that what is commonly known in the media and amongst our policymakers as the rainy day fund, which in fact is not something that was created to be saved away for a rainy day, but rather is there. It's a resource that's available to our legislators as they look to addressing our budget. These two pieces would allow for that to be considered as part of the available revenue to address needs. In terms of other reporting, SB 1369 would look at local impact of tax exemptions and other revenue measures, so that we make sure that as we address costs in our state budget, we're not just passing off costs to our locals. The SB 195 looks at the documents that our Legislative Budget Board, which is responsible for both creating our draft budgets that our legislature works from, but also determines the physical impacts of various bills. SB 195 would make all of their documentation and kind of their processes more public by posting their documents on a website. SB 541 would require our state agencies to report what percentage of their budget comes from federal revenue, and to also report out what federal dollars they're leaving on the table that would be helpful in terms of meeting their mission and services. So that might be a burden on our agencies. The impact of that is not quite clear, but that's another piece of transparency that is being considered right now. In terms of increasing revenue, there are a bunch of options that are being considered. HB 53 and 54, I think, are particularly interesting because what a lot of folks don't know is that a lot of our corporations get tax benefits for just doing what they're kind of supposed to, turning their taxes in on time. And so this would reduce those amounts significantly and give us more revenue to use towards our budget. HJR 57 is a proposal to consider an income tax, which is a well-researched and a well-researched piece considered to really be an equalizing sort of tax mechanism as opposed to a consumption tax, which is what our current budget is largely based upon. SB 1136 is also worth probably your attention and consideration. It would increase revenue by creating a cigarette tax and fee for those companies that are not currently in our part of the settlement that our cigarette companies were subject to. We'll be talking about a soda tax later in our presentation today, so I won't get into that, but that's another consideration that our legislature is looking at that would provide us a lot more resources to address our needs. As we talk further about public investments, there is also quite a few proposals that would look at ways that we actually restrict the available resources we have. The first set that you'll see there, limiting revenue options, that's a series of bills that kind of do so categorically. We've never had a problem as a state in terms of limiting ourselves in looking at possibilities for new taxes and new ways of raising revenue. But there traditionally have been session after session a bunch of proposals that seek to limit ourselves even further and categorically not allow for some revenue options to be had or to really make them a more onerous process. There are also a bunch of tax loopholes that are being considered this session, things that would allow for either bigger carve-outs for corporations or that would create whole new ones. HB 515 in particular gets to carve out for alcohol as well as some motor tax pieces. Another piece that's probably worthy of your consideration just due to the size of it is HB 800, which is a research and development tax break, but in fact it really its definition of innovation is really, really, really broad and therefore would have a fiscal impact of $440 million that we would be leaving on the table, $440 million that right now we rely upon for our budget that we would no longer have available. And then the last category of bills you'll see there, spending restrictions. And this, again, is sort of categorical in nature, kind of artificially saying that we should not grow our budget. And so this really kind of limits the legislature's ability to be flexible within the needs that are presented. It's sort of our state equivalent of what you see in terms of a federal sequester, where kind of across the board restrictions in terms of our growth. In particular, you might be interested in HB 306 and HJR 52. Both of which are actually targeted to a subset of our budget, those areas of our budget that are specifically addressing our most vulnerable populations. So these two pieces would go specifically to TANF, Medicaid, CHIP, programs that are for our vulnerable and for our children.